This is going to be another one of my video log type style videos. And in it, I want to discuss why I sold my gravel bike. And this video will kind of go to the topic of what goes through our head when we buy a bike. We often have aspirations when we make a purchase based on things that we think we're going to do with a bike, for example, and not necessarily based on need. So in this video, we'll talk about want versus need when it comes to buying a bike. I had a lot of aspirations for my gravel bike. Now don't get me wrong, I still ride gravel as much as I did before, sometimes even more. In fact, yesterday I did a 70-mile gravel ride on my cyclocross bike that was about 10 miles of open paved road. The rest was rail trail and gravel. I think it was 40 miles of gravel and about 20 miles of rail trail. And in fact, I'm going to show scenes from that ride during this video so that, one, you don't have to look at my face the whole video, but also so that you can see the type of roads that I ride. But when I purchased my gravel bike, I had intended it to be one that I would take on events in the mountains, maybe even doing bike packing, multi-day type events. But after having the bike for a year, that never really materialized. And I came to the conclusion that if I drive all the way to the mountains, I want a trail ride. If I had to boil down the funnest, most enjoyable type of riding that I do, it's driving to the mountains and riding my trail bike. Now I'm about 6.5 hours away from really good mountainous type riding. Not too far, but it's still somewhat of a haul. And I ended up not doing any events out of state on my gravel bike. Most of the events that I do are gravel races within 2 hours of my house or cyclocross races within two hours of my house. So I just never really used the gravel bike for what it was intended to be used for. So I wrote down a few reasons that I wanted to share in this video of why I ended up selling the gravel bike. And I'm going to go through those, and then I'm going to talk about how I use my cyclocross bike, some of the modifications that I do to make it a really good gravel bike. So the number one reason why I sold my gravel bike is because I like to keep things simple. I wouldn't classify myself as a minimalist, but I'm not really that far off. I like having a few quality things that I really focus on, that I really keep up. I like keeping my bikes up to date. I like working on them, keeping them running well, but really focusing on the 3 bikes that I have. So I have 2 mountain bikes and my cyclocross bike. For me, 3 is the number. Some people like owning 10 bikes. Some people, their number is just having 1 bike. For me, it's 3. That just tends to be the magic number for me. I like changing out my cyclocross bike every couple years. I like changing out my cross-country mountain bike every year or two, either frame or whole bike. My trail bike, probably every 3 or 4 years. So again, I like keeping things simple and not having to, spread my bikes too thin, so to speak. Number 2 reason why I sold my gravel bike is I want to be in the same riding position on my cyclocross bike on the gravel roads as I am for the races that I do. So the riding position on my gravel bike was really similar to my cross bike, but not exact. And changing your riding position just a little bit can use just a little bit different muscles. So my cyclocross season, as most people's, starts in September. And during the summer is when I do a lot of my gravel riding. The trails in my area kind of can get wet, muggy, buggy, and I really enjoy riding my cyclocross bike, especially early in the morning, like on a Saturday morning, when the trails are covered in dew or rain from the night before. And in fact, in my area, the gravel roads are better when they get a lot of rain. So in the summertime, they're actually better to ride. The washboards are pretty much gone because of all the rain, and they drain really well. So I do a lot of gravel riding in the summer, and that leads up to my cyclocross season. So I want to be on the same bike riding my long gravel roads as I'll be on when I put my tire on a start line in September at a cyclocross race. One thing that I also found is during my cyclocross season, when I had intended to just have my cross bike set up just for cross and my gravel bike for riding longer rides, I ended up using my cross bike more than I thought I would. When I do my openers on Friday, if I'm racing on Saturday, I'll do my openers on Friday. I ended up putting back on my mirror, putting back on my pump, my seat pack, and going out on the roads to ride because I wanted to be on the bike doing my openers that I would be racing on the next day. And so even though all that stuff only takes really just a couple minutes to do, I ended up doing that to, get on the same bike that I was going to be on for the next day. So why not just set it up on Monday after the race like that, do a couple rides on it during the week, and then just pull those things off for the race weekend. The number 3 reason why I decided to sell my gravel bike and go only on my cyclocross bike for gravel is because cyclocross bikes, I found, are absolutely the perfect type of bike for the roads in my area. Gravel can take on many different forms. There's really not one set style of bike for gravel because it varies so much. Gravel riding up in the North Georgia mountains or in Virginia or in Colorado is a lot different than gravel riding in north central Florida. And so I found that the cyclocross bike, because of its agility, because of how light it is actually the perfect bike. Most of the people in my area that ride cyclocross or ride gravel do it on cyclocross bikes not because they don't want to buy a gravel bike, but just cyclocross bikes tend to be comfortable enough for long gravel rides, and they're really quick. And so that is, the conclusion that I came to is my cross bike is just really perfect for gravel. Geometry is one thing to take into consideration, and I covered that in my cyclocross versus gravel video. And by the way, one of the reasons I'm making this video is I kind of felt obligated because I wanted to follow up that cyclocross versus gravel video with this one. And so this is, kind of the conclusion I've come to after a year or so of owning the cyclocross and gravel bike. So back to geometry. As I mentioned, the cross bike being good for my area, I don't need a really slack geometry bike. That really comes into play in the mountains. And when I don't want to go flying 40 miles an hour down a mountain on a cyclocross race bike. It's just too twitchy. But because I don't really go up to the mountains to do events on my gravel bike, it's just really not necessary. When you're doing the gravel rides in the mountains, the slacker geometry to me is more important than if you're riding flatter terrain. And if I ever get up to the mountains to do an event, a cyclocross event, I would just use my Niner RKT9 RDO, my mountain bike. Now the riding position won't be the same, but I see a lot of guys when I look online doing cyclocross type events in the mountains on mountain bikes. They would kill it on the descents. And my Niner RKT9 is about 22.7 pounds. That's lighter than my gravel bike was, my RLT9. And by the way, that was my gravel bike, if you're not familiar with some of my other videos. So I had the Niner RLT9 Steel. Phenomenal bike. One that I would highly recommend if you're looking for a gravel bike. The Steel was so comfortable on that bike. But if I'm going to do the rare event up in the mountains, a cyclocross event, I'll just jump on my mountain bike. The number 4 reason that I sold my gravel bike is because I found that doing local events, gravel events, that always turn into races, even if it's a non-race event, quote, they always turn into races. When you got people on bikes riding together, it will turn into a race. But I preferred my cyclocross bike because, again, of the agility, and it just ended up being a faster bike on those type of rides. The number 5 reason is because oftentimes I will ride trails on my cyclocross bike. Now, it's not as fun as riding a mountain bike, but there is somewhat of a fun factor in that you've really got to choose your lines. You've really got to hop over things carefully, and it's really good practice for cornering, really good practice for learning how to handle a cyclocross bike. And so I like riding trails. I enjoy riding trails more on my cyclocross bike than my gravel because of the geometry, the agility of it, and the higher bottom bracket. So getting over logs is easier on the cyclocross bike. So I want to talk about how I use my cross bike as a gravel bike. My cyclocross bike right now is a Giant TCX, and that bike makes a very, very good gravel bike for a few reasons. One is it fits pretty big tires. It fits 40C tires or more. In fact, I have a lot of clearance on that bike with the 40C tires. I could even go bigger than that. So that's why I always recommend when you buy a cross bike, make sure it'll fit 40C tires. That's a really good width. So the modifications that I do on that bike is, again, I put on gravel tires. I use the Maxxis Ramblers, really excellent all-around gravel tire that I'll actually keep on during the whole off season, and then right before cross season starts, I'll switch to more of a race tire, cyclocross race tire, and I'll just leave those race tires on until December and put the Maxxis Ramblers back on. Also, I moved the handlebars up a little bit, so I just put a spacer underneath the stem so it's more comfortable for longer rides. I'm in a more upright riding position, and I actually really like it. In fact, I think I'm going to leave it like that when cyclocross season starts. I feel like it's just a little bit easier on the back and the neck when I'm riding gravel, and I think it'll carry over to cyclocross racing. And then I put on another water bottle cage. So in cyclocross season, I only use one water bottle cage, and during the off season I'll just throw in the other one. During the cyclocross season, I don't do really long gravel rides. My longer gravel rides go from about February until about August, and then I back it down. So I can get away with one water bottle in the bike and one in the jersey during my longer weekend rides on the cyclocross bike. Another reason the Giant TCX makes a really good cross bike is how comfortable that carbon is. Some carbon is built up really stiff, which is fast for sprinting. The Giant TCX, I think, is a perfect balance. It's still stiff, it's still light, but it's not an overly harsh carbon. In fact, the fork on that bike is one of the most supple, rigid forks that I've ever ridden. It just is a really comfortable fork. So that frame, that chassis, makes a great gravel bike. In fact, it's the same chassis that Giant uses on their TCX SX line of bikes. That's their higher end gravel type race bike that is really the same frame. They just put bigger tires, which I did. They use wider handlebars, a wider gear range, and also wider handlebars. So that's how they modify that. But again, it's the same chassis. So by adding the gravel tires, I'm getting closer to that. Talking about gear range, so the Giant TCX uses a 1x system. Not a very wide gear range. In fact, the rear cassette goes up to a 28. But because I'm not using in the mountains, I don't need a wide gear range. It's plenty low enough for steep hills that I have around here. In fact, the steepest hills I ride are in a cyclocross race, and I've never had a gear that was not low enough for a cyclocross race. And the 40 in the front and the 28 in the back, I can get up to about 28, 30 miles an hour before I start to spin out. So it's plenty of gear range. Now, if you're riding in the mountains, yeah, you're going to need a wider gear range. Whether you use a 1x with a big cassette in the back, a big range, or you have a 2x in the front, you're going to need a bigger gear range. But again, I don't use it in the mountains, and that gear ends up being perfect for the type of riding that I do. Also, the bike has 140 millimeter rotors. I don't necessarily need a 160 rotor on that bike. In fact, when I'm riding my gravel roads around my area, I hardly even touch the brakes. The bigger rotors really help in the mountains. Not so much for power, because cyclocross tires are not that wide. It doesn't take much to lock up a gravel or a cyclocross tire because they're not that wide. The bigger rotor really helps, one, for heat dissipation, so the bigger rotor is going to dissipate heat better so your rotors don't heat up as much on a descent. But also so that you do require less effort to brake. So if you're going down a mountain and you're braking a lot, using bigger rotors, you're going to have to apply less effort and you'll get less hand fatigue on the descents. So that's why the Giant TCX that I use, it just makes the perfect gravel bike for me. And when cross season comes around, it doesn't take much to convert it back to a cross bike. Just change out the tires, pull off the water bottle cage, and I'm good to go for a cyclocross race bike. Oftentimes when I look at people doing gravel races, for example the DK200, they're on cross bikes because cross bikes make really good fast gravel bikes. Now the DK200 is not a real mountainous type race. It's rolling, there's some big hills on that event, but it's not one that's really mountainous like you would get maybe in Colorado or in Virginia or North Georgia. And so that's why you see a lot of people on gravel bikes. In fact, Rebecca Rusch won the DK200 on a Niner BSB9 RDO. That's Niner's cyclocross race bike. That's 200 miles of racing on gravel on a cyclocross bike. That's the bike she chose. Now she'll probably choose this year, I would imagine, the new Niner. Niner came out with an RLT RDO, which is a carbon gravel bike. I knew they were going to do that. They finally did it. I thought a year or so ago they would have done that. So now they have the aluminum, the steel, and a carbon. So you're probably going to see more people racing that RLT9 RDO. Really sweet bike. Love to get a test ride on one. But my point is that you still see a lot of people racing gravel on a cyclocross bike. So what I want to leave you with in this video is when you're buying a bike, sometimes it's want versus need. Sometimes it's should versus could. Could I buy a downhill bike? Yeah, I could probably move around some assets and swing a downhill bike. Should I buy a downhill bike? No, not for me, because I don't use it that often. I'll ride downhill every once in a while. I'll do some shuttle days, but I'll rent a bike. There's no need for me to purchase a downhill bike, even though I could. So there are a lot of things to consider when buying a bike. Even if it's not gravel versus cross for you, hopefully some of the things that I've said in this video will help you in that bike buying process. So I'd love to hear questions and comments that you all have out there on this topic. So leave those below. And if it was helpful for you, give it a thumbs up. And I appreciate you watching. See you in the next one.